And that probably won't go in. That won't go in this year, but we're doing the planning this year, and hopefully get in a position to get that in next year, sometime very soon. The grant actually gives us 5 years to get the pump in, but it would be great to get that going before then. And then other fundraising and working to get the rest of the project operational so we can have a boat shop and a museum in there. And one of the main components of our fundraising to date has been our sublease with Delta Western for a fuel dock at the boathouse. And unfortunately, that dates back about 4 years, and so far, if you've noticed, there isn't a fuel dock there yet. And we're still working with Delta Western, and we're supposed to meet with them this month, and they're making progress towards it. And that will be a huge boost to the project to get the rent revenue from that. So that will be pretty much with that. That will put us in a position to get the kind of operation we want to have going on over there. So that's just sort of a basic overview of the construction. Another thing with our education and history component of our organization is tonight, right now, Rebecca is going to be taping the panelists. And we've been doing that the last several annual meetings. And we're trying to get more stories collecting from people in the community, oral histories, written histories, and be collecting those things. And one place that we do collect them, and we'd like to have all this stuff at the boathouse eventually, but is in our newsletter. If you've gotten our newsletter, we have copies back there, is just putting a couple stories in. We always have historical stories in there. And I'm always looking for new historical stories. And if you have a historical boat or have ideas for historical stories, take a look at the last newsletters, maybe that'll inspire you. Please contact me so we can get more stories and have a great next newsletter. Otherwise, this is one of our main events for the year. We're always looking to do other events as well. So again, contact us for other event ideas you might have. We'd love to get a boat building project underway, project ideas we haven't been too successful at getting underway with a kind of an educational, hands-on community events like that. But that is something we'd love to do. We're trying to show a movie. We've been trying to show The Spawn of the North, which is a 1930s movie, for the last 3 months. First we were going to do it at the movie theater, and it was Christmas. Then we were going to try and do somewhere else, and that just keeps kind of keeps bouncing around. And maybe in late February, early March, we'll be doing that. So look out for that. And I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to say about our organization. And I just wanted to give a little overview before we get into the meeting about just some early history on herring. Our panelists will probably be going back almost as far as I'm going to do here. I know that when I talked to Mr. Nielsen today, I know that he had knowledge of things that happened before his time, he said. So maybe I'll have information that will be touched on by our panelists. But I just wanted to give a little brief overview. Harvest levels, what was going on, and I don't think our panelists will be going back quite that far. So just from my notes, from just a little brief research, the early herring operations were the reduction plants, which Ms. Light here will be talking about, and we have a map in the back which shows the location of all the reduction plants over time. At the peak, I think there were 18 herring reduction plants, which were mostly up and down Chatham Strait. There were some on the outside, I think, and as far up as Tenakee. And but the first one that opened was the Kilsnahoo plant up by Rangoon, and that was 1883, and that was the main plant for about 40 years. And at that time, they were getting between 5,000 and 10,000 tons of herring a year were going through that plant. And after about the 1920s, a lot more plants came online, and the peak year was 1929. And there were 3 boom and bust cycles in the early herring fisheries between 1920 and 1960. And the first one, it started about 1920, and it peaked in 1929 at about 80,000 tons. And that's when there was the peak number of operations of reduction plants. And then it came all the way down to 0, largely because of overfishing. And by 1940, there was 0 herring being caught. And they had to stop the fishery and all throughout Southeast Alaska. And they promptly started it up again. This time they actually had quotas, and they had a second boom and bust cycle. And that time they got up to about 50,000 tons being caught throughout Southeast Alaska. And then it crashed again. And then in about 1950, mid-50s is when it went back to 0, and there was like a year or 2 of non-fishing. And there was one more cycle, and it again went up to about 50,000 in the late 50s, and then went down to 0 in the early 60s, and that was the end of the reduction plants. And then just quickly, Grant Miller here is going to talk, I believe, a little bit about bait fisheries. I don't know if that's what he has planned to talk about. One of our panelists, but there is an early history I just got about the bait fisheries. The first, when halibut longlanding started in 1895, it says herring were back then, as now, probably the preferred bait. And in 1910 was the first, Ketchikan's New England Fish Company opened and was freezing herring for halibut bait. And so between 1910 and 1970, there was about 2,600 tons were being harvested for bait. And then it went up in the 70s to about 6,000, and now it's much, much lower. And then finally, the roe fishery, which I think everybody's familiar with, that started in 1971 and was a result of the 1960s. The Japanese market, or the Japanese fishery collapsed essentially, and they were doing it way earlier there, and they came looking in other places. So that's the main herring fishery now. And I guess I'd just like to turn it over to our panelists, who I'm really happy could come down. We have Joy Light and Grant Miller and John Nielsen, so if you could all come up. And I turn it over to Eric Jordan, too, who has a lot to say about herring himself, and is kind of our annual moderator every year. And we scheduled a meeting to a day that Eric can make it, so this is a good night for Eric, and we're really appreciative of him coming down. So thank you all again. Take a seat. And what we're going to do is... John. Yeah, John, Mr. Nielsen, do you want to come up and have a seat? And
Come on up, John. Come on up, John.
Oh, John Dunlap's he going to talk? No, John Dunlap's on our board. I think it's a good chance for me to introduce our board. Could the board members all say hello? John Dunlap, or Mike Littman, John Dunlap, Rebecca Polson, Joe D'Arienzo, and Chris Bruton are our board members who are here. Linda Blankenship, who just got reelected, couldn't make it tonight. She's down south. And we're going to have our panel discussion here for probably about an hour or so, and we'll have a break, and then we'll turn it open to everyone in the public who has stories to share, memories, or knowledge of herring, and we'll have a break in between the two, take a look at our pictures. We also have a rake from the park in the back, and I'm not the person to talk up to about that, so hopefully someone along the line here will talk about rakes, and if not, maybe someone will come up later in the night. And yeah, we have cookies and all that when we take our break. So thank you again very much.
Well, let's give a big hand to Andrew. It's amazing. I've been coming here for years and seeing this group grow. And of course, we have a good crowd almost every evening. And I've been suggesting for years that we get around to herring, as we've been talking about the various subjects, and it's something that's a great part of the maritime history here of Sitka is the herring abundance that goes back thousands and thousands of years. And I thought Aaron Bean was going to be one of our panelists. Does anybody see Aaron?
Oh, he couldn't make it.
Okay, well, so it's the four of us up here, and she was part of a reduction plant in Southeast, and on my immediate right is John Nielsen, who has some perspective on herring, and actually John and I have worked together on trying to conserve particularly halibut in the Sitka area. And Grant Miller brings a perspective from being a commercial fisherman for many years. Also, Grant had a bait pound over in Alakina for several years, and then Grant's been involved in fisheries politics for practically forever. And so he brings a combination of perspectives there. You're not involved in fishery politics anymore, Grant?
I try not to be.
Anyway, what I thought we'd do to start off is we'd start off with Joy, whose family has an involvement in the reduction fishery, which was by far the longest lasting and the biggest herring fishery in Southeast until modern times, when we've pretty much gone to bait and sac roe fishery. So what I'd like to do, Joy, is ask you to tell your story about your family history and involvement with the herring fishery and being out there on the site.
And maybe bring that mic. Bring the mic over.
Mostly it was great fun growing up and being very small and having all of the men that were in the plant that worked. There was several different sectors. There were people that worked in the plant. There was another group that was specially to take the herring from the boat. When the boats came in with the load, they would be the shovelers, and they came down and took the herring out. And all of the pictures are back there. It's sort of hard for me to talk without the pictures, without showing you, because the pictures are really great. My mother took all of the pictures, and I have luckily preserved them for all these years, and it seems, I'm told, that they're very special and that no one else has those pictures, so this is really cool. As a kid, it was just great. I mean, I had, when the freighters came in to pick up the meal or the oil, you never saw me on dock because the captains always had ice cream and watermelon, so I was always on board the boat. So it was, and we just played. I mean, it was a wonderful place to go fishing, and I'd go down when it was low tide, and I could go down and see all of the starfish, and we had Walter Iredam was there one year, and he was a scientist for the museum in New York.
For the Smithsonian?
Smithsonian.
Yeah.
And he would take specimens of all kinds of critters, and he had them in little jars, and in his room just rows and rows of this, and he found a bear bread that was to fit 5 people behind it. I believe it was the biggest one ever found, and there was just always something exciting happening there. We came in with the fish, and there's pictures there with me on board deck where they had board going over the cabin. When you went into the cabin, there was, the fish were so high that the water ran through the water line. They were all the way down, and the fish were just all the way up the deck, up to the bow. And they had slats on the door to get into the mess hall that were stacked up like this, so we had the board across it, so you had to go in and then jump all the way down to get inside, because the fish were just piled all over. And the fish were huge. I mean, these little guys were big. They weren't these little things that we have now, because they could age and grow. And it was just amazing. I would really encourage you to look at all of the pictures, because it shows you. And how we got the herring out of the holes was to take, and we had a ladder. It was a fish ladder, so it was sort of like an elevator with these buckets that go around and around and up onto a conveyor belt and into the factory. And there's pictures of that back there too. And when they got in there, then of course they were turned into fertilizer and oil. First of all, we'd cook them and get out the oil, press them and get out the oil, and then cook them and put them in big sacks, penny sacks for the meal. And my mother told me that there was 87 products that came from the fish, and the only 2 that I remember, because I thought she was crazy, was because she said it was nylons and perfume. And I couldn't figure that one out, and I wish I remembered the rest of them that she rattled off to me, but I didn't copy all that information down. I was told to stay out of the plant and away. Little girls are supposed to just go away and not be in danger, because the plants were really dangerous. There was no safety, and it was quite dangerous to be out of there. Again, there's some pictures back there of the oil barrels, of the sacks, and of everything going up and down. And I don't know if they put the ones of my brother and my sister and playing with the dog and on the boats and things. But as a child, I want to tell you, it was the best place in the world to grow up, and I'm real happy to be a part of it, and also not a part of it because my mother was the one. Why we're the oldest standing or the longest standing herring is because my mother went to Washington State to get it extended after it was stopped. And so now I really want to keep it there. That's like my fish. You don't fish my fish, because I just really think that the preservation of the herring is really important.
Joy, where were you?
Huh?
Where were you?
Washington Bay and QU Island. It was called
Okay.
Storgold and Grundle Packing
And-
Company.
And what years was that? I'm sorry, maybe that was inappropriate. As usual, I made a faux pas here.
I was a little girl.
I
That's
think we
good
figured
enough.
1957.
1957, somewhere around there.
Yeah. Well, I also have some history with Washington Bay.
You do?
Yeah. My father came to Alaska on a herring seiner. And in 1940, and they were supposedly one of the years when it crashed, which was my father's luck on a lot of things. But he was they were fishing out of there before the war, and I don't know if you remember any of the names of the boats, Joy?
Besides ours, the John W. and the, I can't even remember the other ones.
Okay. Well, anyway, my youngest sister Linda was named after one of the reduction seiners, which were big. They had actually been used in the sardine fishery and then came up there. And the Linda is actually still active in southeast Alaska, packing fish down in Neats Bay. So every time when I'm down there fishing and I see that boat, it reminds me a little of the history of the herring fishery. And to just give you a little insight, while they were in unloading, which took quite a while, as you described in those days, while they were unloading the herring, my father would take some of the herring and choke them up and go hand lining, rowing the skiff over there in Washington Bay, over on the bluffs right at the entrance as you come in there. Is a really good spot. And that's what got him hooked on king salmon fishing. So after he volunteered for the Navy in World War II, that's what brought him back to Alaska, where he bought a little trawler. So small world that we both are familiar. I spent a lot of hours playing on the beach in Washington Bay, and of course was there right after it closed. And it was the last place. There were 4 herring seiners left in the early 60s, 64 or something. And they brought them to Washington Bay, where they brought the herring. Before that fishery died out, hopefully never to be resurrected again. I'm sorry, but it was kind of a disastrous deal. So I wanted to invite, we're going to go through the panelists here and hear the stories, but if you have any questions as things go on of the panelists or stuff after they tell their story, raise your hand and we'll do it that way tonight. We'll, so I see Matt Donahoe has a question. You want to...
Does anybody know when they stopped whaling in Chatham? There was as Rebecca pointed out to me earlier today, that there's a connection between whaling and herring population. You know, whales eat herring.
I know we had a plant, we had the remnants of a plant at the end of the bay, but if they told me when it stopped, I don't know, but it was pretty dilapidated, so it had been years.
Yeah, I
Years
can't,
before
I'm
that.
sorry. I can't say for sure, Matt, but when I was doing some research just for the little stuff I just mentioned, when they're mentioning that first boom bust cycle that peaked in 1929, the reason that went to about 80,000 tons, where the following 50,000 ton peaks, they thought was because there was a short, and I don't know when, if there was whaling after that, but between 1910 and 1923, there was a return of whaling in Chatham Strait. There had been prior whaling that stopped, and I don't know if other people have a better idea, but that one ended in 1923. I don't know if there's anything else, but they thought when the whales were eating herring, obviously, and when they killed a lot of them in that like 13-year period. They thought maybe that was one reason it really went off for a little while. But that's my best answer, unless someone else has others.
Wow, great question. Maybe the herring abundance was related to the aftermath of the whaling and the marine mammal reduction that went on during the years of the whaling. There is a great book, I don't know where my copy is, but there's a history of whaling in Alaska that has a whole chapter on southeast whaling. For example, there were whaling stations at Whale Bay, and I think over there at Port Armstrong there was a whaling station. There were multiple whaling stations around southeast. So it's interesting to try and think about the correlation between the cycles. Of course, whales are increasing about 7% a year in southeast, so who knows what effect that'll have on the herring. Well, what I'd like to do is introduce John right now and ask him to give his perspective on the history of herring here in Sitka. And without further ado, John Nielsen.
Thank you. Okay, my name is John Nielsen. I was born and raised in Sitka, Alaska since 1929. I will be 83 years old. I'm still too young. I've seen the fisheries and the herring going downhill. Kitchcan, Heidelberg, Craig, Hawk Bay, no fishing. Because there's not enough fish to open a fishery. They were fished out. Now Sitka is going to be next. When, I don't know, but we'll be out of herring before we find out. I always maintain that there's a level of no return on the herring. The wildlife will do the rest. They have to eat. Whales, killer whale, porpoise. Seal, and the
Bears.
okay, that's just part of it. Now, I'll come back to that, but I would like to say a little bit about the reduction plants. Or saltery, whatever they call them. There's Thunder Bay, Killisnoo, Ron Bay, Demoncoff, and a few others, all in Chatham Strait. In 1900, my father was born at Killisnoo reduction plant there, because his mother was working there. And later on in years, we went to some subsistence herring in Keg, Alaska. Some of the old timers came over there, they wanted to share stories. He said when he was a young man, he used to stand on deck of a boat in Chatham Strait. You could hear the herring, just like it was raining. But it wasn't raining, it was the herring all coming up to the surface. Made a lot of noise. I don't know if everybody ever heard that. Those were smaller herring, which they called sardines. Now there's no fisheries there because it was all gone. skipping around here a little bit. Many of you people remember Mert Sarvilla. She was our mayor, 1956, 57. Those sardine fishermen were outside of Chillicothe. They were gonna fish out there until it's all gone. But I don't know if she went to DC or Juneau. When she came back, talk about Sacro. Well, just before Sacro, we had a fishery of kelp, Macrocystis kelp. All the little boats were fishing in the area by Baranoff Point. God, there was a lot of Macrocystis kelp there. Herring spawned on that. That's what the buyers were taking. And only 1 year. But after that, they opened up this Sacro fishing. The first year they had Sacro, it only took 2 hours, they got their limit. As the years pass now, it's up to 3 weeks just to get their limit. Everybody else say, when is it gonna quit? When they fish it out, they will quit. Because the wildlife has to have their share. Sea lion, one of the biggest takers of herring and salmon. All you guys that have been fishermen out there know what a sea lion can do with your fish before you get it aboard. Half a fish. I've seen that a lot of times. Because I fished with my dad. During World War II, my older brothers went to service. I stayed home and I fished with my dad. I wasn't even a teenager yet. So I went trolling with him. When the trolling was slack, we used to go out to Biarca and go jig halibut, so we have a bycatch and make it a few dollars. So the first fish I caught, I think I was 11 years old. I started pulling up hand lining, got it up close to the boat, and made teeth about that, and the mouth about that big, big sharp teeth. And I let it back down, and I tried to told my dad, "You better pull it up." He started laughing because he knew what it was. Lingcod. They got a big mouth. That's the first time I ever saw one. So he laughed out there, and okay, I'll go along with it. So we fished outside of Cape Edgecombe, Chillicothe, and Biarca. But early in the morning, say like 2:30, 3 o'clock, when daylight starts, we used to get buzzed by P-38s during the wartime. If you didn't have a boat number registered, you were dead. They would shoot you. That was the law. Thank God we had a number on top of the cabin. So that part started to grow up, and then Sacro began fishing. They'd have a 2-hour opening for the first fishery. And then they start getting longer and longer. But every year they increased the harvest level, never decrease. They never took a conservative measure on Sacro fishing. even this year, they raised the quota. If they're not stopped now, might as well say goodbye to the fisheries. Not just the herring, but the king salmon, halibut, and all the wildlife. It must be stopped. Between the sacro fishing and the charter boats, like Eric said, we went up there on testify on Sitka Sound because the level of halibut and king salmon were dwindling. We put a stop to that because my grandson's father, Wade Martin, and I went up to Anchorage to testify. In Anchorage, the federal subsistence, they put a stop to charter fishery in Sitka Sound.
Or halibut. Or halibut in the
For
summer.
halibut.
Yeah, or halibut in the summer. John, do we want to give Grant a turn?
Huh?
Give Grant a turn? Give Grant
Yeah.
a turn?
Okay, we can come back to me.
Yeah.
Sure
You
have
can say
plenty more.
something, you got something to say?
Well, I might surprise you. I've actually, I've been involved in herring since the late '60s.
Thanks, John.
And I fished fish traps on the East Coast, Cape Cod Bay in the late '60s, and I fished Lampara Seine for herring in San Francisco and Bodega Bay in the early '70s. And came to Alaska in '77, built a boat specifically to gill net herring in '80, went to Togiak. The fishery was over by the time I got there, but I ended up over the years fishing Togiak, Prince William Sound, Cape Romanzoff, Good News Bay, Norton Sound, and in Sitka I had a bait pound here in Sitka. So I've had quite a bit of experience in the fisheries over my fishing career of 40-odd years. I also spent 6.5 years on the board fish, and I listened to a lot of comments about herring over the years. And I will say this at least about the board of fish when I was there, the resource was always the first top priority, and it was always a priority over any other aspect, whether it was finances, income, even subsistence. The resource was the priority. And if you don't have the resource, you don't have anything. So I was happy to be a part of that. I feel confident that the fisheries are managed for sustainability. I've seen, since I was involved that closely to present day, I've seen the stocks here in Sitka appear very healthy. Maybe not in other areas of the state, but here in Sitka, I think it's probably one of the best managed fisheries that I've encountered in my time here. But it's certainly something we need to pay attention to all the time. I don't think it's something that we should take for granted. Even the best scientists can make mistakes, but I think the trend has been that the stock of herring here in Sitka has been quite healthy. So anyway, I had a bait pound.
Tell us about the bait pound, because it was, I actually got bait from Grant over there a few times, and it was one of the neatest things around the area with the eagles and the herring and the pound, and I was always a little envious that you got to live out there and do that. So tell us about that. Tell us about the feeling of being there.
First
getting
thing I
them.
want to say was that John's right about the sound of the herring. I used to sit out there all by myself in the skiff and wait for these fish to come in Alakina Bay and move along the shore. And you could hear it. It sounded like rain on the water, and you could see those little ripples, and it was really exciting. I mean, and there were a lot of aspects to it. But I bought that the bait pound from Merle Edlow. Probably most of you remember Merle. And Merle taught me how to set it up, and I ended up with Lionel was part of my crew for a while, and Lionel's very experienced. And set the, watch for the herring to start to show up in the spring. We'd go out and we'd set the pond. It was a 3-sided net. The 4th side was the shore. And it sat up in Alakina Bay. And when the herring started coming in the spring, they would lead along the shorelines and they would follow that shoreline, and you would open one end of that pond. It was like half the net that went to the beach would swing open. And so you'd sit there in a skiff alongside of it and you'd watch the fish come along. You'd watch them feed along the shoreline and come into the net, and they'd begin to swirl around. The pound would hold about 100 ton of herring. It was pretty big. I mean, it would hold a lot of fish. And once they started getting crowded and realized they were trapped in there, they'd start to swirl and they'd want to turn around and go back. So you'd have to swing your gate closed and wait a while for them to settle down, and then you could do it again. Sometimes I got 100 ton in there, sometimes I only got 20 or 30, but it was a tremendous experience. And then the whole idea of that was, of course, to sell bait to the halibut fishermen, and that was before IFQs. And when the IFQs happened, of course, the fishery spread out over the years, so there wasn't much of a call for the herring then. But the boats would line up. I would be sitting out there, and they'd have like these 2-week or 48-hour openings for halibut, and boats would just line up. They'd be lined up waiting to come get herring. We had a small seine, a 50-foot seine that we'd set inside the pound, bring them up and braille them into the boats, and guys would bring their salt or whatever and put up their bait right there and bait up and have fresh herring for bait. The sea lions did not come around in the early days because I think the previous owners had quite deterred their activity there. So I didn't have to deal with them for a while, but over time, the younger generation of sea lions began to show up. And then the other thing that was kind of fun and discouraging was that the bears would come down. And at one point, when we were out there, there was a sow that had 3 cubs. She had 2 from the 1 year and 1 that was still with her from a previous year. And they would just come down and sit at the end of the net. And this was the net was spawned on. The herring eggs were all over the net, so they just started tugging on it. And I'd come out there, and there'd be just the whole thing was full of holes, and sometimes most all the herring would be gone. But anyway, eventually, when I tried all kinds of things. I tried staying out there 24 hours, and whenever I'd hear something, I'd fire off a gun, and all I got back were snarls and red glowing eyes looking back at me. The thing that finally deterred the bears was I'd hung a transistor radio in the tree in each end of the net and turned on Raven radio. Anyway, that was it was a great.
I don't know about the rest of you, but that is the most unique use of Raven radio that I think I've ever heard.
Was it a news program?
24 hours. What was your show, Dave?
No, I didn't say anything. Yeah, I had to do it.
Is that about it, or you
Well,
got?
there's, as
Go
far
on,
as
finish your story.
well, I think as far as the bait pound goes, it was a great place to be. It was quiet. You were very, very close to everything. The eagles. I mean, some days you'd look up in the trees, there'd be 200 eagles in the trees. And I did that by estimating, kind of like 40 or 50 in one spot, and then looking around, I think there was probably at least a couple hundred in there. And also, when the herring bait pound was in there, you could actually get crab in Alakina Bay, which was kind of fun. They would follow the herring in there. So, I don't know, it was just a great place to hang out. It was just a springtime thing, and I'm kind of sad that it's no longer a part of our fishing activities.
Talk about the birds there. Talk about the birds for a little bit.
Well, I don't know if I have that much to say about the birds. I mean, the eagles were here's one story. Eagles were there all the time, and I remember off to the side and my awareness at one point there, I picked up on the radio that there was the Raptor Center was releasing a couple of eagles, and they even had names. I forget what the names were right now, but they were going to release these 2 eagles, and well. I it must have been a time when there wasn't that many eagles around, but the 2 eagles that were released, apparently it was them. They showed up at the herring pound, and I kept the aluminum boat I had out there then, and there was a lot of salt around, and in the bottom of the boat was a lot of dead herring that was really salty. And I came out there one day, and there were these 2 eagles were out there, and they were just sick as all get out. And they were flopping around, and they just were throwing up, and they eventually died. But I had to believe that those 2 eagles were the 2 that had been released from the raptor center, because they had no skills of hunting or whatever, and they just came, they found these herring, and they ate them, and they were so salty that it was their demise. So, sorry to say that about what happened with the raptor center's eagles, but I'm pretty sure that's where they were. But I took the eagles up in the woods, and I left them up there, and a couple years later I went back, and I have one of the skulls still at my house. Not a whole lot of good bird stories out there.
Well, it's amazing the stories you get when, we started out here to talk about herring, and we've heard about lingcod, and we've heard about birds, and we've heard about whales. And what I want to do here, though, there are some other people in the audience that have quite a bit of involvement with the herring fishery. But instead of calling them out, what I want to do is take a little break, and we've got we'll take about a 10-minute break. We've got goodies back there, and it gives you a chance to visit with each other. And then we're going to come back, and I'm going to recruit some people to make some comments and interact with the panel. And did you have something you want to do before I did that?
If you would please, I want to ask Grant why he left. You feel vaguely on that.
Well, the main reason I left was that the juvenile sea lions became a bigger and bigger problem, and I didn't want to have to resort to illegal activities to prevent them from creating problems in there. I experimented. The herring bait pound had been operated in other parts of Sitka Sound, and I tried a couple of them unsuccessfully. One year I put it in Whiting Harbor, and I caught a juvenile humpback whale in there. That's a whole other story. I tried Cassiana Island, and I think I tried over by Pirates Cove, but none of them were as successful. That was kind of the best place. It was obviously it had been settled on as a good spot, and the herring, as far as I know, still kept coming in there. I just had difficulty dealing with it in there.
Well, anyway, what I'd like to do then is take a short break. We'll have the panel come back up here, and I'm going to prime a couple people that I see out there to be sure to make some comments, because there's some people that have been involved in fisheries here in Southeast for a long time that I think it'd be great to have on record. So without further ado, let's take about a 10-minute break. Let's come back here at 8 o'clock. We'll come back and we'll continue the meeting. Sitka is the first place that the state established a minimum threshold before they would have a sacro herring fishery. And that happened way back in the winter of 1976. And in 1977, we didn't have a sacro herring fishery in Sitka because we didn't meet the minimum threshold. So I've asked a couple people to talk about that, and then what I'd like is to have some question and answer people. Grant's been involved in Board of Fisheries for years. There could be some questions there. Joy's got the experience at the plant. And some of you have had a chance to look at the pictures. You might have some questions. And John, of course, has a long experience as a subsistence advocate. And so what I'd like to do first, though, is I talked to a couple people in the audience. And I know Larry Calvin When I first moved to Sitka, the reason I signed up for the Fish and Game Advisory Committee here in town was because I was concerned about the herring resource. And Larry was the chairman at that time. And so there was some effort to conserve the herring back in those days when we only had 7 or 8 miles of spawn a year here in Sitka. So Larry, could you come up and talk about some of those? It's way back in the 70s now. And some of the fishing that went on and stuff. Would you use the microphone?
Is
so
Jim
that-
Parker here?
No, he's not.
He should be. Jim Parker was the fish and game biologist in those early years, and he was responsible for the initial setting up of some of the harvest levels. And John alluded that we never really had any real serious restrictions, but we did. That one year, we could not come up, Jim could not find the amount of herring that the advisory committee here had recommended. And so he came to the advisory committee, and we all agreed with him, we should not open it unless we could find that quota. And the fishermen, as one would expect, were absolutely livid. The fellows from Ketchikan and Petersburg all had been up here, as they always do, and they were extremely upset about us not opening it. And they waved their fist at me and said, if we're down in Ketchikan, the advisory committee down there would demand it be open. And I said, why don't you go back to Ketchikan? You already closed it. You don't have any herring anymore. So, but there was a lot of bitterness there. So all the fishermen got together and petitioned the governor, who was it back then, petitioned the governor to demand that Jim open it. And the governor called the head of the fish and game at that stage, and told him to tell Jim to open it. He called Jim Parker. Jim said, no, if you want it open, you come over. I mean, here he was laying his job on the line. So, so Jim called me and told me what was happening. So I got on the telephone. In those years, the Fish and Game Board was the same. We didn't have separate boards, Fish and Game. So it was just one group, and I called 4 or 5 of them around the state. And the head of the Fish and Game had sent his deputy over here to open the season because Jim had refused. Well, on the way between Juneau and Sitka, the word came down from the rest of the board. No, if they say it isn't going to open, don't open it. So that when the fellow came in here and says, Jim, it's your call. And Jim said, no, we're not going to open it. But here is the Fish and Game agent that laid his job on the line. So, and it's never been written up, but I think that needs to be recognized and written up. So there's no, and then we had something like, I'm sure the Fish and Game people in here to correct me, I think it was down to like 5 miles of spawn that year that we had. It was very, very small. It sounded like 5 miles would be a lot, but we have 50, 60 miles of spawn now, or something like that. It was very low harvesting. Yes?
What year was that, Larry?
Sheesh.
Hard question.
Here's a little of the history, if I could.
Yeah, okay. I'm 77, so I can't remember things very well. I don't know.
The year the advisory committee, we made a proposal that unless there was 7,000 tons of herring estimated by acoustic soundings, how they estimated it in those days, that there shouldn't be a fishery. There had to be a minimum of 7,000 tons. And that actually passed the Board of Fisheries. The Board of Fisheries met every year, and it was actually the Board of Fish and Game. Larry's absolutely right. They split up shortly after that. But they decided that they went along with the recommendation from the Sitka Fish and Game Advisory Committee that there should be a minimum threshold that was the first in the state. And I was secretary of the committee, so I wrote it up. Larry was the chairman, and I just heard some of the history here I have never heard before. And the point of going into these stories is herring has been a big part of Sitka, and the battles and the beliefs over herring is a big part of, and will continue to be a big part of our heritage for many, many years to come. But the winter was 76. The stuff Larry's describing happened in the spring because Jim didn't find 7,000 tons of herring to open the fishery, and he said he wasn't gonna open it, and that's when all this came. My little role as secretary is I'd written up the motions and submitted the proposal to the Board of Fish and Game, and then when the fishery wasn't gonna open, two people called me. One was Charlie Carlson, who was on the committee, a local herring seiner. Another was my longtime friend Harold Thompson. And they both said, well, we want to get the record of this. We're actually thinking of suing to have the fisheries open. And I said, sure, I've got the minutes, but I don't think you want this publicized because you both voted for the motion. Nobody ever came by to get a copy of the minutes. So that's, without interrupting Larry any further, that's part of the history, Matt.
What, 76, they were doing acoustic sounding. When did that change, and what technique did it change to for estimating wow mass?
I couldn't answer that. I was not that involved in the later years of that.
That changed, I believe, in the early 80s. They went to, the way they assess the herring biomass now in Sitka is they actually do it by measuring the amount of spawn. And so they map the miles of spawn, and then they have divers go out and measure the density of the spawns with transects. And then they get an estimate of the trillions of herring eggs that have been deposited, and then they backcast from that to estimate the amount of herring. And then they predict they sample in the mortality, and then what's going to recruit the next year. Fish and Game should be explaining all this. But anyway, then they come up with an estimate on next year's stock based on the spawn from the previous year, which, quite frankly, folks, it's an inexact science. But on the other hand, you've got something solid to measure, which is the deposited herring eggs instead of the acoustic estimates with sounders. So it's an improvement, but it's not perfect.
My Uncle Jack was working with Ed Ricketts in the early years of marine biology, and I called him at this time, and he was very definite, a little like John had alluded to. You can have tons and tons of fish out there, but that may not be enough to take care of continuation of the stocks. And so we were following those feelings. And maybe it's just sheer coincidence, but they never did have another closure. But the next year, there was a little more fish, and a little more fish, and there's been increased since those years, increase in the herring stocks. So, any other questions on this particular issue? And I'll tell you a funny story.
Anybody opposed to a funny story from me?
Well, we had, John, I have to, no, you're older than I am, so your memories are probably better. But there was at least 3 years of herring eggs on kelp that we harvested them. And at one year, we were doing that. For a couple of years, we've been getting herring eggs on kelp. And, you know, things are pretty tough in those years. A few bucks meant a lot of difference to some of us. And I was one of the first early divers in southeastern here and in Sitka. So I was down in the water with just my wetsuit on, just wading through with a mask and snorkel, and I was doing pretty good getting them. But then we were having a hard time finding the herring eggs in some of the areas that they wanted to open. So some of us proposed, Eric said he thought Jim proposed it to me, but I can't remember that. But nonetheless, we decided we were going to take kelp from over on the cruise offshores where the herring normally didn't spawn, transplant it over to all of the islands over here into some of these bays. So Moses Johnson and on his boat and me on my funny little boat all worked for some weeks corralling, diving down and getting a hold of the holdfast of this Microcystis kelp, hauling it all the way over the islands. And we had sort of been led into the idea, when we had a rope tied onto that, it was going to be ours. Then we started getting, I wonder, and so I started calling the Attorney General. Fortunately for him, he was out of the state at that time, they kept telling me anyhow, and he would not make a ruling. We could not get a ruling from the state troopers or anybody. If we had a line onto something down in the water, would that be ours or not? Well, Moses Johnson had enough prestige that he kept all of the scavengers off. But my buddy Willie Osbakken and I had some, at least 20 boats all around us, all with their grappling hooks, all a hold of our lines and our kelp. We didn't get a single dime out of that whole weeks of work. Moses came out, he got some, he did all right, but we didn't. But you're hooked onto it with your line, who belongs to it? But anyhow, that was some of the early stories, and there was three. But I think that those of us that were diving for Microcystis kelp in those years should have been entitled to some kind of a permit when they started all of these herring eggs on kelp on these pens up there. But funny, nobody ever came around to offer me. But I have a record. They would say, well, that how can you prove that you were eligible? Well, I have a record on the books that the two Wyman boys and I were out in my boat. The Fish and Game came up, and I didn't have all the documents, so they arrested me. I got fined $90. It's on the record that I worked on that. Anything else? Eric?
Let's give Larry a big hand. Wilson, when you come up, what I wanted to do was get a perspective from a subsistence harvester. And I didn't see Bill Payton or some of the other people I know, and maybe you could chime in, John, too, on the nature of harvesting subsistence herring, which really, you know, we've been talking about the various commercial fisheries and stuff, but the subsistence harvest and the trading, bartering of herring eggs, been a big part of the culture and economy of Sitka for thousands of years. So I thought we wanted to hear that perspective. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to kind of tell you how we go about gathering it. I can tell you that I've been doing it with my pop for a long time. And it's a really important part to us of spring. It's like the coming and opening of gifts. It's like a gift. It's the herring come, and now it's time to gather, however we're going to gather. And so we go out, we watch everyone, we look around, we try to see where the herrings start to spawn, because if you put we go up in the woods and we gather herring branches first, but if you put your branches in the water too soon, then they'll get an algae on them, and then the eggs won't stick. And so you can't just go put a bunch of branches at any old place, and I mean, some people do, but you may not get the best quality eggs that way. So we always get young branches, not any that have any of the hair kelp or anything like that on them. I mean, that white hair stuff that grows in the trees. We just get nice clean branches, and when we see spawn starting somewhere that's a place that usually is fairly good, we'll take those out there, and then we have some cord and stuff, and usually a bunch of milk jugs or whatever kind of plastic jug we can rustle up, and we put our name and our phone number on them. And we go out and then we climb up on the beach and find a couple rocks. And first thing we do is we're wrapping the bottom of the branches so that we can weigh them down, because they'll float up to the surface and then that spawn wouldn't be on them the best way. So we tie a rock and drop it over the side, and we have a line with the buoy to one of those jugs, and then we hope for the best. And you have to go out there pretty often and watch them, because sometimes they seem to walk away by themselves, especially if you ended up with some pretty good eggs. But it's been a real important part of my life. We also go after the herring roe on kelp, and we also sometimes we look for the hair kelp. We used to find that in Whiting Harbor, was one of our best places, but with that DVEX in there, I don't think we'll be daring to go fishing for that, unfortunately. But then the first thing we do when we get home is, it's like we're packaging up and sending off to family members in, Juneau, Ketchikan, Hoona. We send them to all the places that don't have them there anymore, so, and even a few to Seattle to one of my aunts. But it's just part, for us, we don't get anything given back to us for doing it, except I take it back. My Uncle Joe always sends us some, what do they call that? It's a, yeah, the Yukon River salmon strips. That's always the favorite, and then Pop hoards them. So I have to go down and snitch him out of his freezer when he's not looking. Mine never lasts very long, but I think he just gives me the smallest amount because he knows I'm going to come back and get the rest. So anyways, that's kind of how it goes. And while you're out there floating around, of course, you get to enjoy seeing the seals and the sea lions and just being close to, and the whales are there. You can sit there and they'll just float around sometimes. And of course, we might have a little bit of brandy in a flask and some jerky or something to tide us over till we get back. But it's fun. You get to see people out there doing the same thing. Some of them put big trees in the water, but we never did that. And when we harvest them, especially the branches, if we harvest them and we bring them up and we cut the pieces away that we're going to keep while we're on the grounds, so that we can put all the scrap pieces back into the water so that nothing gets wasted. Did you have a comment? Oh, I thought you were waving at me.
No.
Okay. So anyways, that's and of course the pan of water goes on the stove the minute we get into town so that we can cook some and eat them immediately, and then the ongoing process.
Tell us about preparing and eating the herring roe. And I wanted to get John or anybody else in the group too, but tell us about the special flavor of herring roe and how you fix it.
Well, it's kind of crunchy. I love the pops, but when we go into town, we never use boiling water. We have fairly hot, just kind of before boiling water, because if you have it too hot, especially if you have really heavy branches with a lot of eggs on them, they'll turn into like rubber and be overcooked. So we would put our branches in the water, just dip them in and out pretty much, and then it's butter and soy sauce usually. I think back in the old days they probably used seal oil, but I haven't had to eat them like that. And then we do the same thing with the herring roe on kelp, except that I happen to love it. I leave the butter off and use soy sauce and wasabi mixture and just do it kind of like the Orientals do, with a little dip like that. And then we also make salads and stuff from them as well. So if any of you have never tried them, you really should try them because they are really good. And it's also kind of I don't know, to me it's a spiritual thing to welcome spring in, to have those first things.
Bob?
Yeah, what kelp is it that eggs on kelp?
We use the macrocystis kelp.
Macrocystis?
Yeah,
okay.
that's the kind that when it anchors on the bottom to rocks on the bottom, and it has every so far spaced apart big fronds that are kind of shaped like this, and they can be quite long actually. And when we cut them, one of the things I don't know if everyone knows, but if you break off the frond at the bulb, they'll grow back. But if you just rip them apart or take the whole thing, you'll ruin a spot you could go back to again and gather again. You remember that. So,
John, did you want to comment on eating and sharing raw on branches?
Some.
Speak into the mic there.
From what I learned as a young boy, I used to go out and harvest heron eggs before I was a teenager. And my grandmother, she never spoke English to us, what I should do, what kind of tree to get. Now, you talk about tree, there's a certain type of hemlock tree that you use. They're not all the same. And when you pay attention to it, a tree hemlock would be flat like a fanling. Those are the kind of trees we're looking for. We don't just go chop down any hemlock tree, because the fan wing and eggs will be a lot thicker. You don't have to put too many branches in. Now, to find a spot that they're spawning, we used to go out at low tide, sit our trees just below low water, not very much, and try pulling them up when they're harvesting time. They're pretty heavy.
yeah.
And you talk about macrocystis kelp. Well, for my grandmother, I used to pick kelp off the beach, the big wide leaf kelp. Eggs will be that thick on them. That's what she likes. So she
Use that kind.
stewed that up, and it's good eating.
John, when we were on working together on the halibut committee, one of the things I asked you and you told us was the name of halibut in Tlingit. I was wondering if you would tell the audience here and me, or maybe just me, what the Tlingit name for herring and for herring roe is?
Okay, the Tlingit name for herring would be yow.
How do you spell that? Or
It sounds Y-A-W.
there's a little story. Yow, is that right? Yow?
Yeah, yeah.
Because when I was broadcasting, I learned the Tlingit name for good. So I was broadcasting basketball games and I was going, Yaki! John informed me that I didn't have it quite right? And I was saying something that didn't mean it. You want to tell that story?
That's good. Okay, herring roe. The Tlingit name is Out. Don't tell me how to spell it. Out. That's heron eggs.
Before we go, you might, since I brought it up, you might tell them the Tlingit name for halibut.
Chot.
Jock.
Chot. Got it?
Got it.
Yeah.
Yuck. You're not gonna tell them what your key was, huh? Well, we'll move on. Moving right on. But that's part of why the Heritage Society does this kind of stuff, because I don't know about you, but I've learned tons here tonight. And a couple more things before we moved on. Some of the rest of you, I've had lots of questions. You just saw an example of me asking them. If you have a question from any of the panelists or anybody here, now's the time to step forward and ask that question. Or you'll have to hear me ask a few more. Come on up forward and use the mic.
Oh, I'll just,
Well, we want you for the record, we want you on the tape.
Thank
Am I done, or you want me to stay up here?
I owe Dan Edelin, so I have to do that, folks.
all right. Well, we just heard the amazing stories about subsistence importance, and I'm just a recent worker for the tribe, and so I was wondering, hearing aids are so important to our elder generation, but I've also noticed at annual dinners, kids are just as excited about them as well, and I was wondering if if teaching about egg harvesting was a big part of it as well, and or what it means to like the younger Tlingit generation.
Well, I guess for me, you know, we gathered for a long time, but I don't really know how other Tlingit families. I would assume that they probably go out and go with their family to learn how to do that. Is that right, John?
Well, yeah, so, it's getting so, now, not just the native people are harvesting the heron eggs, but find out that it's very excellent with salad, the best. As Dan Adeline will tell you.
Grant?
Yeah, I just want to say, I love them raw, and when I had the herring bait pound, I would just grab handfuls of eggs right off the net and eat them right there off the ground. That was the best, that's absolutely the best way to eat them.
Savage.
I'll just leave it.
The good
You
one.
gotta have fun.
Well, one other thing I wanted to say, Eric, is that the row-on kelp fishery that takes place like in Hoona Sound and whatnot, most of that kelp for that is harvested in, at least it used to be harvested in Sea Otter Sound. The kelp fields were bigger, kelp forests were bigger and more healthy, and just, so they would fly it up. They'd actually go down and cut it, pick it up and fly it up here to Hoona Sound.
Grant, you were on the Board of Fisheries, well, and you made some decisions on herring. I think you might have been on when we raised the minimum threshold here in Sitka to 17,000 or something tons. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I don't know how much I can remember, but I do know that I'm pretty sure that the harvestable amount of herring is a maximum of 10% of the biomass expected that year. So they try never to go more than 10% of whatever that biomass is for that given year. And that gives a pretty good leeway. Now, I mean, John brings up another point too, you know, that the other wildlife that eats herring it's kind of an aspect that you can't really calculate. How much herring all the whales are going to eat, how many whales are going to be around, and all that sort of thing.
Sea lions are the biggest
And sea
ones.
lions, yeah. And actually, the whales eat the salmon fry out of the hatcheries now too. So.
Well, yeah, and Grant has it right. At the low levels of the herring biomass, as I understand it, just having gone through it again, we had a big meeting here a month or so ago in Sitka on it. It's at 10% at the lower levels of the threshold, but then it goes up from there to about 20% at the high biomass levels, which they estimates are here now. So that's why the quota is so big this year. It's not 10% of the biomass, it's at the higher end. They have a sliding scale again. But we're not gonna get into all the herring politics, but just be advised, there's a lot of herring politics.
More politics than there is herring.
But I have, Jerry, if you could just wait, I have a little herring, a fun story of myself. My first commercial fishery on my own was jigging herring off the dock in Petersburg. And we tie up the little hooks, little gold and silver hooks on little strings, and you jig them up and down, and you'd catch the herring. Then I'd try and, I just loved catching them. Then I'd try and go sell them to the halibut fishermen and stuff, and I wasn't having any much luck. Well, one day my sister Karen, who's just about 13 months younger than I, she was down there, and I said, Karen, why don't you sit by the dock with the herring and try and sell them? Lickety split, she sold the salmon. So I was out there catching, I caught some more. And I learned something about marketing. Jerry.
I'm just going to defer to John. I think John's been trying to get your attention.
Okay, well, my boys were pretty young, and I used to take them up fishing up inside, mainly one of my favorite spots is up in Sitka Bay. They would jig herring, like he was saying, the gold hooks and stuff like that. And my two boys, one was 7 years old, the other was 8 years old, and they were on a float at Sitka Bay, known as Chatham, Alaska, cannery. They were jigging herring, and the youngest boy, he was reeling his herring in, and all of a sudden a big key salmon took the bait, hook, line, and sinker.
Joy?
Up on you.
Joy, it's been a long time since you've said anything. I was wondering if you had something to add here.
Well, every year I go out with Robbie Littlefield and gather for all the elders, and we pack them in huge boxes, and it costs about $100 a box now to send them down south to the elders that have moved down there. And it takes us hours and hours and hours going out and trying to lift up these things, and people do steal them, and we'll spend hours in the kitchen, you know, sorting them and cleaning them. And then the best part that I like too now is with on the kelp and breading them and frying them in coconut oil. And they're so good with this, you have these little chips, and then you just eat them just like potato chips or skins or something, and that's really great. But anybody wants to help Robbie Littlefield out in helping her with sending all of these eggs that we gather south, that would be greatly appreciated. She's a great lady and has taught the children the heritage, and she does a great job with the language, and I'm very close to her and very proud to know her. She's just done a great job, and she's quite a subsistence lady.
I agree. I agree. Does anybody have some herring stories of their own, or want to talk about pickling herring? We've talked about eating roe and roe on kelp, but we haven't talked about pickling herring.
I tried to do
There we go. There we go.
Hello. I know most of you folks. I've had something to do with herring too. I fish with Merle Enlow. When they're arguing politics in the Pioneer, the trollers would be complaining, oh, they're taking all the herring. He said, your king salmon are taking our herring. I grew up in Camino Island, and Lawrence Wakefield lived down the road. We were there, had returned in '76 or so, and he had a picture of one of those sardine packers on his, he was an old man then, he'd been a fisheries agent in Indonesia and Korea and that, and his brother was Lowell Whitefield and that. Anyway, he told me they were herring fishing in Chatham in the 30s, and they'd go out and load that packer any day that they could get out in the winter time. It was like one of those 80-footers. Just go out and get a little bit and run the plant, put it away like Joey was talking about, but in prior years. The value of the herring is another issue too. I fished with Merlin. We had a couple 100 tons down by Goddard, and it was, and that was in like in '79 or something. Was it $1,000 a ton or $2,000 a ton?
Yeah, it was used to be 1,000 a ton and 100 per each percentage point over 10%.
Yeah. It was very valuable. It was a very good thing to catch a few of those. Price is way down now, I guess.
My bait was worth more than what they were saying.
Anyway, that's what I got.
Thanks, Mark Howie there. Thanks a lot. Rich McClear, come on up. Did you ever think, Rich, that one of the uses of Raven Radio would be for bear?
Actually, in northern Minnesota, we had crabapple trees right outside the radio station, and a bear came right down and started eating crab apples, and then turned around and looked, and the window was open, just a screen between our volunteer and the bear was looking in at the volunteer in the air room, so he just cranked the monitor up. It was opera. It was a soprano aria, and that bear just headed right back in the woods. Matt Donahoe asked me to tell a story that we were both involved with. In the early years of Raven Radio, we were trying to do the best we could at covering the herring fishery. One year, we sent Barnaby out in a skiff with a remote control unit, and he did a play-by-play like it was a sports event. So like, and look who's coming in to cork this opening, and it was just, that got a lot of positive response. Well, Scott Simon from National Public Radio heard we had done this, and he wanted a story on the herring fishery. So Matt and Barnaby went out in a skiff right in the middle of the herring fishery and were recording the sound so we could do a sound portrait of the herring fishery. Well, they got up right up under one of the tenders that was sucking the herring up, and getting all the noise of the fish flapping and the sucking sound, and the pipe broke. And all the herring came down and swamped Matt's skiff. And it was great sound, except that it was really difficult to use because the Federal Communications Commission would have shut down the station if we had actually broadcast. And so it was one of the most complicated editing jobs I've ever done, and making that sound so it was usable. And then, of course, at the end, we had this $1,000 tape recorder. It was brand new, like the second time it was out, and it went into the water. And so we got it out, and one of the hardest things I've ever done was fill a tub with water, fresh water, and put the tape recorder into it, and let it soak, and then I could take it out, disassemble it, and do each part with a hairdryer. And we actually got the thing working again. But anyway, National Public Radio, Scott Simon got his piece for Weekend Edition on the herring roe fishery. And it had a lot of really expressive sound, but not the most expressive sound.
Well, one of the great things about this event is the stories. And if you've got a story related to herring, well, Signy's coming back up again, and the panelists, if you've got one, raise your hand here.
No, I was going to tell you, I didn't know if I ever told you that. I worked one herring sacro as a herring roe technician. And I ended up trained by the Japanese technicians at Sitka Seafood.
Now wait a minute. Are you still ever going to talk to her again? Go ahead.
Anyway, I just thought it was pretty wild one because it was like a week or two of training. They had me looking at all these eggs and ripping them out of the herring. so that I would know how to figure out the percentages and everything. And then they had the opening, and that was probably the most exciting trip I ever had, was that day that they had the opening. It was out by Redoubt, and it was I think it was 1980 or 81. Anyways, it was just big old surges, and they had a little lund. And they had me in the bow of the lund with a bucket and a few other tools that I needed. And they literally just run the skiff right up to the back of that, and then somebody just like tumbled me from that skiff into the nets on the back of the boat so that I could go in, because they'd have a purse up next to the boat, and they would dip out a sample, and then I had to do all the counting and weighing and sorting and all of that to figure out whether or not they, and whether the roe was mature before they would decide whether they were going to keep that set or not. But anyway, I just thought that that's one part of the story that probably not too many people are aware of. Nowadays, they just take it all back to a biologist and they do it. But that was an adventure. And then I ended up on Wyman's North Star, that 150-foot packer. And we went, actually it was like a factory ship. We went all the way up to Cordova. I was on the boat all the way up to Cordova. And it was an interesting experience. Anyway, that's my story.
Well, I want to tell a little story. Not that they invited me to tell all these stories, but I've given you all the rest of your chances. But I was taking a class in, Bill Foster's probably taken this class too, an outdoor naturalist type thing around Sitka. So, and part of the thing is, it was in the spring, right about the time herring were spawning, and so they had us go on a little kayak thing. And I never forget, we took off from there on the coast, over by the Coast Guard, Browns Beach or something, and we got in this kayak, and there was some gal in the class, I can't remember who it was, but we went in the kayak and we went north by Apple Island just as the herring were spawning. And I'd been in the fishery, I'd seen herring spawn, I've gathered herring. I've been with my dad, they talk about the herring rake, when my dad herring raked the herring for bait. And we were out in the spawn, and the most amazing thing as the herring were spawning was the smell of it. And nobody else, I see you nodding, Pat. Maybe you could come up and tell something about that. But there is a really distinctive odor right when they're starting to spawn, just as the melt, and it was something, usually I was in a boat or a plane or something else that I'd never experienced before. And you probably know what I'm talking about because you've been out there. But it's, and then the other thing, as I was looking at some pictures, I didn't even bring them down, but one year my daughter-in-law and son were here, and this hasn't been talked about, but a lot of the herring row on the kelps and stuff, when it gets, if there's a storm, it gets washed up on the beaches. And I have pictures out there by Magic Island where there's just herring row this thick. And then a lot of people in town, neighbors and stuff, put it into their gardens. It's especially good fertilizer. So I don't know if anybody else has any stories along those lines, but the stories on the uses of herring and the harvesting of herring could go on and on.
One thing I might say there.
Go ahead, Grant.
One of the things that maybe not everybody knows is that the herring will spawn, and then they'll spawn on top of spawn and spawn on top of spawn. And once you get beyond 3 layers, the first spawn won't survive. I think it's 3 layers. So what sometimes happened on the herring pound, because they were all confined in there, and if they did, which most often they spawned right on the net, after a period of time it would get so thick that the inner layer, the very first layer that was spawned on, that was attached to the net, would rot, and then that stuff would just fall off in big peeling flakes, just huge amount, just big carpet-like flakes would just fall off. So you can have 2 densities of a herring spawn, so that the lower layers don't survive. I just thought I would let people know
somebody else said something, we might as well wrap this up. It's been a lot of great stories, and I want to thank the Maritime Heritage Society and the panelists. And I think, and I'm going to want you to give them a hand here, but beyond the politics, and beyond the food, and beyond the resource, there's a spirituality to herring. And it was a little bit alluded to in all these stories, but also the fact that it's a signal of spring here. And when we think of herring, we got to think not about all these practical things, but also there's a spiritual element to herring, especially in this community.
Can I add to that?
Go ahead.
I don't want to hurt you, but it's pretty important because the very first fishery that I ever fished was a fishery that targeted herring right off the bat. And I ended up standing in a boat probably waist deep or more full of herring. And I looked down and I saw all these eyes. And, you know, it seems sort of funny in a sense, but it had a different on me. It had the effect of letting me know that there are all these creatures were giving up their life for my life. And it stuck with me throughout my life. So it doesn't matter whether I'm fishing or hunting or whatever. These things that we harvest for food are giving up their lives for us. And it's that's a part of the spirituality of being in this life.
With that, good night.